All right, everyone, welcome to our breakout session today. You are joining us in the Emerging Issues and/or Research section. My name is Dr. Blair Schneider, and I'm with the Kansas Geological Survey, and I'm really excited to get to moderate this session with you all. Just a reminder, please use the chat function to ask questions or comment throughout the session. I'm going to be monitoring that. So if you put questions in at any point, we'll be able to come back to them. And do keep yourself muted during the presentation so that we keep that audio noise out of the background here. We'll have about 15 minutes for the presentation, and then I'm going to save a good 5 minutes afterwards for questions there. And a reminder that PDH hours are available. So if you'd like to sign up for PDH credits, just visit the KWR website and navigate to the PDH credit form on the Governor's Conference page. So to get us started today, we're going to be hearing about a partnership for the 21st Century Watershed Revitalization, Renew the Blue. And our speakers today are Scott Schulte and Heidi Mel. If I said your last names wrong at all, I apologize. Let me introduce you real fast. So Scott has nearly 30 years of experience in the environmental field with a focus on the revitalization of natural and human communities and the built environment. He earned a Master of Urban Planning with an environmental and land use planning emphasis from the University of Kansas in 2002. He's a senior environmental planner and natural resource discipline leader for Vireo, a community planning, landscape architecture, natural resource management, and public engagement consulting firm. Scott also serves on the board and was the founding president of the Heartland Conservation Alliance, a not-for-profit alliance and urban land trust that helps regional organizations conserve land for natural and community benefits. Through HSA's conservation and policy work groups, Scott is working with academic and not-for-profit partners and agencies to develop climate mitigation and adaptation strategies, watershed report cards, conservation programs, and public policy recommendations. Dr. Heidi Mel is the Director of Water and Agriculture Programs at the Nature Conservancy. Heidi's been researching water issues in Kansas and abroad since her undergraduate years at the University of Kansas. After receiving her BS and Master's from KU, she received her PhD from the Department of Geography at K-State with a focus on fluvial geomorphology, nutrient cycling and riparian zones, and cultural aspects of water management and access to water resources. Her research has included partnerships with Friends of the Kaw, Kansas Alliance for Wetlands and Streams, the Upper Wakarusa Raps, the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, as well as Gorno-Altai State University in Siberian Russia. Heidi is interested in understanding how changes to our landscapes impact the quality and quantity of our water resources and the implications for both people and nature. So welcome, Scott and Heidi. Thank you.
All right, thank you. It's great to be here. And I'm going to do most of the talking because Heidi has back-to-back presentations today. So I'm going to do most of the talking, and she'll jump in here to talk about some of our recent research. Yeah. So anyway, So my bio kind of covered pretty much everything I'm going to talk about today in a nutshell. So Heartland Conservation Alliance is coming up on its 10th anniversary. We were actually incorporated on January 9th of 2012. So we're just hitting the 10-year mark. And really, HCA, really embodies the whole partnership aspect of what we're trying to do and what was needed to do watershed conservation and land conservation and multi-benefit conservation in an urban area. So the organization was created to fill this huge gap in doing watershed-based planning, conservation, and outreach and alliance work in an urban area that's very, very politically fragmented with all sorts of different partners who have all sorts of different missions that actually overlap. So through my day job as an environmental planner, I was working with all sorts of partners, public, private, not-for-profit, governmental agencies at all levels. And we were doing all sorts of planning in watersheds for all sorts of reasons, flood reduction and water quality and mitigation, recreation, land use planning, habitat conservation. And lots of the plans were all saying, hey, we need to conserve all of the same areas, our riparian areas and our floodplains and streamways, but for a variety of uses, environmental, recreational, economic, human, social uses. All these plans were telling us we need to do this, but there was really no one organization in any of these situations that could actually make it happen. It was nobody's day job to do this work. And so really the catalyst for this project, a lot of this happened in the Blue River watershed in Kansas and Missouri in the Kansas City area, which is the most studied watershed in the United States, literally. So in the mid-2000s, one of these many planning projects, the Upper Blue River Watershed Initiative, it was stated by Kent Lage from Johnson County Stormwater, well, if we can't do cooperative watershed management in the Blue River, we can't do it anywhere. Tried to form a governmental alliance to do just that. It fell apart pretty quickly, and a lot of us were saying, well, I guess we can't do cooperative watershed management anywhere. But others said, you know what? Einstein's definition of insanity, we need to take a different approach. Rather than trying to have governments do it, we need to network all of the organizations together. Let's create a not-for-profit, private, independent organization whose job is to do this and to network all of these partners together. And so this is exactly what we created, was the Heartland Conservation Alliance. As we started doing this, though, what we realized was we couldn't just be a land trust or just be an alliance or just being an education organization. We had to bring all of these things together under one roof to make this work. And that's exactly what we did. So our programs include, yes, of course, the conservation programs, but also a really robust education and outreach approach with all of the communities in which we're working, as well as our member alliance program. And by combining all of these things together and working with all our partners, we're able to be much more effective. Our goal was not to create a new environmental organization. Our goal was to take all the existing organizations at different levels and help everybody be way more effective than we were previously at doing a lot of conservation and revitalization work in our urban areas. So we want the whole to be much greater than the sum of its parts. And so a lot of times we think about public engagement last, but really that is kind of the first thing that we started working on, because we realized that we're working in real communities. And so we had to engage the citizens, the residents, the businesses, the people in those communities to, first of all, recognize all their wonderful natural areas, to love them, and to also help tell us what they need in their communities that we can help them with, while we're telling them, hey, here's what the big picture is, so that we can all work together to achieve the benefits that we all need at multiple levels. And so we've got many education and outreach projects throughout the Blue River Watershed and some of the other communities in which we're beginning to work, so that the communities are really helping us plan. This is a community-based organization. And we are working in both urban core, suburban, and the rural urban fringe areas of our watershed. The partnership part of this, the alliance, was really sort of our key innovation. And we had to figure out how to make this happen. We realized early on that we needed to network the partners, not be an umbrella organization. So we came upon the model of a collective impact organization, where we actually, as HCA, form the backbone. But then we network all of our various partners together who are, have overlapping interest in doing, land conservation, revitalization, and many times, for different reasons, and that they don't realize overlap. So as we bring them all together, our job is to look at the big picture, to look at the whole watershed or the watersheds and see all of the different partners that are working there, figure out where their overlaps are, and then network them together so that they can leverage each other's efforts and money and time, and then bring in new partners who maybe don't realize that they have overlapping interests with us, like the healthcare community or community development organizations. So that we can amplify the effects, as we said, and we can grow the pie, and then we can actually, have orders of magnitude greater impact in our communities. So as an alliance, our alliance members need to get a lot more out of the organization than they put into it. And that's really what we would try to do, is amplify everybody's efforts. And then, of course, we have all the conservation projects, and we're beginning to build our land trust. We've actually just completed the purchase of our first property. We're working on another conservation easement. And then we're working with our partners to do conservation, restoration, vacant lot revitalization throughout the watershed in a variety of locations and settings. So, although, we decided to try something new in 2008, 2009, we conceived of this organization. This is happening all over the United States. So lots of watershed organizations and regions and communities realized that they needed to do the same thing. And really the federal government recognized this too over 10 years ago. They realized that the government, state or federal, was not going to drop a bunch of money on a region to come in and fix all of the urban watershed problems and benefit all the communities, that they needed to work smarter and network their resources. So the Urban Waters Federal Partnership was created initially with, I think, 15 federal agencies to concentrate the financial resources that they had, as well as their technical resources, and to really focus on urban areas where they can make a big difference, not just in flooding and water quality, but also benefiting community revitalization and redevelopment, particularly in disadvantaged communities and regions. So there was a half a dozen, or I think maybe 8 or 9 of these initial suite of partners. And then in 2012, right after we had incorporated, Roberta Vogel-Luyten from the EPA at that time came to us and said, hey, would you work with the EPA to try to designate an urban waters partnership in the Middle Blue River in Kansas and Missouri? Again, most studied watershed in the United States, but we hadn't been getting traction on these big watershed type projects. So we were successful in our application, and then the resources started flowing. Our initial capacity building grant allowed us to create this collective impact model and to start building our alliance and hiring staff, which we've grown over the subsequent 9 years. We've also gotten a lot of technical assistance from our partners, a lot of in-kind work, financial assistance here and there from all of our different partners. And then those partners have grown over time. So we started seeing great not-for-profit partners like the Nature Conservancy, of course, the Conservation Fund, the Kansas Land Trust, other NGOs nationally and locally joining this effort. This project in this program now has 19 partnerships around the country. It's become so successful. It didn't just weather the last presidential administration, it actually grew. It is now becoming a permanent federal program. So as we all started, trying to leverage all the work that we were doing, one of the things we realized is, not just everybody working in silos, but the public had no idea, first of all, where the Blue River was, and all the great work that we were doing. And they don't really understand that you have dozens of partners that revitalize an urban river like this. So one of the things that we did early on was we basically tried to brand all of our collective efforts so that from the public standpoint, it looked like one thing. They just saw that, first of all, that the Blue River exists, and there are all of these wonderful amenities throughout the Blue River, whether it's the bike trails and natural areas and parks or places like the zoo and the stadiums that they can come and join. We wanted to make it a destination and then show all of this great work that was happening by the partners, without any attribution, so that we could build this brand. But ultimately, we knew we need people to use the resource and to come here and love the place because they love what they know, and then they're willing to protect what they love. So that's really a unique part of this partnership that's very critical. Of course, we're working on conservation plans, and our initial thought was, well, we got to preserve and restore everything everywhere, but you have to start somewhere. So we started with 6 action areas throughout the watershed. We've now expanded those to 8, and they'll soon be 9. And you see they span all the way from the headwaters in the southern part of the watershed there in the lower part of the screen, all the way to near the headwaters with the Missouri River and crossing the state line. So we picked locations that are publicly visible where we have opportunities for both restoration and preservation, where people can see it, can enjoy it, can see the fruits of our labor in a variety of habitats, in a variety of urban, suburban, and rural urban fringe communities. And then we can pick great champion species in each of those to kind of champion our work, as well as finding those champion organizations to work on these programs. Another thing that we realized, which I think has been really critical to our continued success, is we all realized we needed to monitor our progress and report back on our progress and see how we were doing. And it couldn't just be water quality, because if all we were measuring was water quality in the Blue River, we weren't going to move the needle for 10, 20, 30, 50 years. But we're trying to do multi-benefit work. So we're looking at habitat, we're looking at people using the resources, the community connections, the redevelopment, the economic development, the shared governance in the watershed. If we don't have a governmental alliance, we have to figure out ways to coordinate our policies, as well as bringing people to the river for that recreation. So we actually worked with funding from the Nature Conservancy and the Heartland, Missouri Department of Conservation, and the legwork of dozens of partners to publish the Blue River Report Card in 2019. And this is actually the old score. We're just about to update it in 2021, so we'll be publishing that in the next couple of months. And you see that we're looking at the watershed as a whole, as well as all of these individual components of our work, and then we can look at the sub-watershed level. So this allows us to have these shared metrics to look at environmental, social, recreational, governance, policy, and development scores throughout the watershed. So we can see where we have strengths, where we need to work. And then we've got a shared grading rubric that we use. So as we've gone and done this work, one of the really important components of it has been the conservation aspect, and particularly the urban tree canopy work, because over the last 20 or 30 years, all of the partners in the watershed, we've been doing a lot of riparian corridor studies and watershed studies on the ground. We've really recognized the value of the tree canopy and the breadth and depth and quality and quantity of our riparian corridors for all the multiple benefits that they provide. So to kind of tell you where we were in urban areas 20 years ago and where we are today, when we all started doing this work, when I started this work early in my career, we were working with the Center for Watershed Protection's great research in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And one of the things that they had identified was that the level of imperviousness in a watershed really dictates whether the streams in a watershed are supporting or not. They saw that there was a strong correlation that as an area urbanized, when you got to about 8 to 10% impervious surface, you'd see the streams start to degrade. And then once you got to about 25% imperviousness, it looked like it was all over and those streams were going to completely degrade and become unsupporting non-natural streams. So we all started with that, but as we assessed hundreds and hundreds of miles of streams and all sorts of settings in the region, we started noticing that maybe that wasn't telling the entire story, because we had urban watersheds with 10, 12, 14% imperviousness. We had very high quality streams. And then rural watersheds with 3% imperviousness where the streams were in terrible condition, others with 3% imperviousness where the streams were in really good condition. And we started seeing that that presence of that high quality riparian corridor, I mean, that was the thing that was differentiating these quality streams. So fortunately, we've been able to add to that body of research through the work that K-State has been doing with funding from the Mid-America Regional Council, the Federal Highway Administration, the Nature Conservancy, and helping scope out the project from Heartland Conservation Alliance and the Conservation Fund. So what we've been doing is we wanted to test all of these things, the value of the vegetation, the role of impervious surface, ephemeral streams versus main stem streams, and then what would happen if we actually go in and restore our floodplain areas to see what would happen in the watershed. So Heidi is going to talk briefly about that study and then the findings that came out of it.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Really good setup. And just briefly, we wanted to partner with K-State to look at the watershed model that they had built out for the Blue River and model different development scenarios and say, if the whole watershed gets built out, what is that going to do to flood impacts downstream? If we protect the riparian areas on the main stem, what is that going to, what effect is that going to have if the rest of the watershed isn't impervious? And so we modeled out, I believe, 11 different scenarios at the end and found, like Scott is saying, that, impervious surface is an important variable, absolutely. But if you can keep a significant riparian buffer width of natural vegetation, not turf grass or things like that, natural vegetation on the main stem and the headwater tributaries, including the ephemerals, that confers a significant benefit to flood reduction downstream. And so that has really guided our work in the upper watershed, especially around those headwater tributaries that are still in fairly good shape and have some intact corridors and intact ephemeral areas. The Nature Conservancy coming into the partnership as a land trust, we were looking at where we can bring value. And that's one of the places that we've been focusing is, helping to fund this research and then looking at ways that we can work with partners to help protect the headwater areas and keep those riparian zones in natural vegetation. And, I've really been encouraged by the work of the partnership, including Johnson County Parks and Rec, including Missouri Department of Conservation, Heartland Conservation Alliance, and Mark. it seems like we are all pulling the wagon in the same direction, and we have some very good key areas identified in Johnson County that, if kept in natural vegetation, will confer benefits downstream.
Yep. I'll just add, the thing that was really most eye-opening to us, though, working in urban streams was, we all had, I think that the conclusion of the riparian or the headwater streams were important. It was great to confirm that. What we learned was actually preserving and restoring those main stems has a big impact on its own as well, though, because we always thought that, once you lost your ephemeral streams, it was sort of game over. No, we can actually make a big impact by preserving the main stems and restoring them. But then, of course, when you combine headwaters and main stems, you really amplify your benefits. So our next level area of study, we're starting to look at climate mitigation benefits. What would happen if we lost all of those 100,000 acres of floodplain forests in the 9-county region? What would happen if we protect them or even amplify the effects by restoring those floodplains? So the next thing will be, we've already identified that we have about 600,000 tons of CO2 being sequestered per year in about 100,000 floodplain acres in the 9-county region. That's about 25% of our floodplains that are still natural. If we actually increase that to 50 to 75 and restore those floodplains over the next 20 or 30 years, we think we can actually mitigate about 2 megatons of carbon a year, which would be about 35% of the emissions in 2050 if we reach our goal of hitting an 80% reduction in our emissions from the baseline today. So that is our next area of study. And just in the Blue River alone, we think we could probably sequester about 90,000 tons of CO2 per year versus about 45,000 tons of CO2 that's being sequestered today. So with that, I think we're probably a little bit over on time, but if we have a minute for a question, I would be glad to. Otherwise, there's our contact information there if you want to follow up with us after the session.
All right, now we still have some time for some questions, and I already see one from Gary here. Could mixing in nut and fruit tree species to buffers add appeal to landowner cooperation and overall value? And how closely does the buffer vegetation selection need to follow native or natural species makeup?
Absolutely. I watched that session here earlier this morning. I was planning on getting in touch with the Kansas Forest Service. So you can see we've got a great opportunity for carbon sequestration to start capturing carbon offsets for this work, layering in agroforestry, both from an ecological health standpoint and then also to start to create cash crops that are natural and that fit within the floodplain areas and that could amplify or add to our funding streams, as well as improving the ecological quality of the corridors, is something that we're definitely looking at. That's an area of immediate future study. So.
Awesome. And a question from Dawn. Could you discuss any challenges with your project in working with 2 different states? That was going to be my question, actually.
That's why we realized early on we couldn't have a governmental alliance that would be the most effective. So yeah, I mean, the state line is always huge, but actually, just within any of the governmental units, it's not necessarily a cooperation issue. It's more of a fragmentation issue. Everybody has to focus on their own function with their own community. So we realized we just had to have a single organization that spanned all of those things. Sometimes though, yeah, I mean, when it's by state, that's an advantage because we can capture more funding and more interest from like a federal level. Other times, we realize, oh, hey, we're only going to work with the Kansas side or the Missouri side for a given initiative. So that it can be a blessing and it can be a curse at times.
And I would just add in that there's a really important environmental justice piece to this work, and it spans that state line because most of the development is happening upstream in Johnson County. And most of the vulnerable communities that are being impacted downstream are very socioeconomically vulnerable. And so, that's a really important piece to keep at the front of our work and address those things. And Heartland Conservation Alliance is doing a really good job working on an equity roadmap and incorporating that environmental justice aspect into this work.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, we have a couple more questions in the chat box. So Scott and Heidi, please check on those and address them there. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed that. Our next speaker isn't here yet, so we're going to actually go next to Aaron. So let me make sure Aaron is set up there. I see you. Aaron, how do you pronounce your last name? I didn't get a chance to ask you beforehand.
Hrozencik.
Hrozencik, thank you. And let's make sure you, perfect. You can share our screen there. So Dr. Aaron Hrozencik is a research agricultural economist within the Resource and Rural Economics Division of USDA's Economic Research Service. He's an applied microeconomist who uses econometric and simulation modeling and experimental methods to explore policy relevant research questions at the intersection of production and natural resource economics. Much of his previous research looks at the relationship between water resources and agricultural production, which includes development of a large-scale, spatially explicit hydroeconomic model to explore the costs and benefits of groundwater management policy mechanisms. More recent research recently published in the American Journal of Agricultural Economics investigates how agricultural producers' demand for water responds to electricity pricing regimes. Thank you so much for being here with us, Aaron, and we'll let you get started.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. And I think this is a great audience for this kind of paper because it's people that care about water, but it's also Kansas, and that is sort of at least part of the focus for this research paper I'm going to present today, which is titled Social Comparisons of Groundwater Use Behavior, Evidence from Colorado and Kansas. And in this paper, we're trying to leverage the insights of behavioral economics to see how we can affect sort of changes around groundwater irrigators' behavior in terms of their water use. So this is co-authored work. I'd like to thank my co-authors, Jordan Suter from Colorado State, Paul Ferraro from Johns Hopkins, as well as Nathan Hendricks, who I think is here, who is at Kansas State University. And because I'm a federal employee, I need to say the findings and conclusions in this preliminary presentation have not been formally disseminated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and should not be construed to represent any agency determination or policy. I did it. Okay, so I'm going to be talking a lot about social comparisons in this presentation. So I think it's useful to start off by exactly what I mean by that. So the notion of social comparisons comes from the social psychology literature. And it's this idea that we as individuals determine the appropriateness of our actions by comparing that with other people. And I think policymakers are well aware of this and use this, to our sort of to reach these pro-social sort of outcomes. So an example of this is the I Did an Ad campaign in South Florida, which shows people going to get the COVID-19 vaccine, and it's just normal people. And the idea here is that if I see someone that looks like me or has a job like me that is going to get the COVID-19 vaccine, that might actually nudge me towards also getting the vaccine because it's changing my perception about what the norm is for my social group. So the applied economics literature has explored the sort of efficacy of social comparisons, providing those in changing people's behavior. Primarily, this has been used, or this literature has looked at used field experiments to evaluate how social comparisons affect consumers' residential electricity or water consumption. So here's an example of what one of these social comparisons might actually look like. This is from a paper that was published, I think, several years ago about how social comparisons affect people's household electricity use. So what you see in this sort of mock bill is we're comparing an individual home's electricity consumption to both their efficient neighbors and their average neighbors. And we're saying, hey, you're using more electricity than your neighbors, actually 8% more. And what this literature has found, at least in the consumer or the residential electricity and water demand setting, is that providing this kind of information actually decreases people's subsequent use of water or electricity. So we know a lot about how these sort of social comparisons affect consumer behavior. What we don't know much about is how they affect firms' behavior. And you might think from an economic perspective that the motivations of a consumer might not actually match the motivations of a firm because firms are trying to maximize profits. So that's sort of the gap that this research effort is filling in this literature. We're going to look at the efficacy of social comparisons in the context of firms. Specifically, we're going to look at this in the context of groundwater, how agricultural firms use groundwater. So I don't think I need to tell this group, but agriculture is immensely important for worldwide agriculture, but also U.S. agriculture, specifically the High Plains aquifer. And the depletion of specifically that aquifer has major implications for the future of Kansas's agriculture, but also the future of agriculture throughout sort of the Central High Plains. And the depletion of aquifer resources have prompted a lot of local, state, and federal policymaking efforts to mitigate and decrease the use of these largely non-renewable resources when we're thinking about the High Plains aquifer. So between 2007, just as an example of this in Kansas, between 2007 and 2020, the state of Kansas, in conjunction with the federal government, spent about $66 million to permanently retire 239 wells with 55,000 acre feet of annual appropriations. And this is through the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, as well as the Water Transition Assistance Program. So this is just to demonstrate that there's a lot of effort in addressing these groundwater depletion concerns, and there's a lot of money going towards that. And what we're going to look at in this context of groundwater extraction, social comparisons, we're going to test how social comparisons influence groundwater pumping behavior among agricultural producers. And we're going to do that using a randomized controlled trial conducted in both Colorado and Kansas. Just to give you a preview of the results, we find that providing agricultural producers social comparison information on their water use reduces water use by a small but economically significant margin. And this is important because, for the most part, these social comparisons are significantly less expensive than these other policy options we have. So I'm going to move on to where we're actually looking at what the area we're actually looking at in this field experiment or randomized control trial. We're going to focus on Eastern Colorado, specifically the Republican River Basin of Eastern Colorado, and the 7 groundwater management districts that are sort of in charge of that region's local groundwater use. In Kansas, we're going to focus on 4 of the 5 groundwater management districts in western and south central Kansas. We exclude the 5th groundwater management district in Kansas due to some ongoing legal issues there. So this is sort of the universe we're looking at for this social comparison experiment. And so here's an example of what this intervention actually looks like. This is a postcard that would be mailed to agricultural producers prior to a growing season. So we're starting off these postcards with what we call an injunctive norm, or just a nudge towards sort of the behavior or pro-social behavior we're looking for. Efficient water use is essential in managing our shared water resources. We're providing them some information about exactly which of their wells that we're providing this information for. We're telling them what the 20th percentile well is, which is kind of like that efficient neighbor in the previous example I showed. And we say who their neighbors are. So in this case, this is a mailer we sent for Colorado. Those neighbors are other groundwater irrigators and wells within their groundwater management district. And sort of the second half, or the meat of this comparison is the second half of this mailer. We provide information on those wells, comparing how their previous year's groundwater use compared to other wells within their groundwater management district or their comparison group. So we provide that in terms of a percentile rank. So you see here, comparing your 2019 water use to other wells in your comparison group, your well used 80% more than other wells. We also provide that comparison in terms of the total volume of water used in the case of Colorado. So you can see here that compared to the average and 20th percentile well, this individual's well used, approximately twice what the efficient well did. So this is what the example of what the Colorado mailers look like that would be mailed previous to the growing season. In Kansas, we changed the coloring a little bit to match the land-grant university's color scheme, because these mailers were actually sent out by Colorado State and Kansas State. So providing the same sort of information for the Kansas irrigators. The primary difference to note here is that because the groundwater management districts in Kansas are relatively large, we're actually providing that information. This comparison groups are counties rather than groundwater management districts. Providing similar sorts of information in terms of the actual comparison, except because Kansas really collects excellent information in terms of agricultural water use, we're able to provide this comparison in terms of water use per acre irrigated. So what we economists would call it the intensive margin of water use, which is perhaps maybe a more salient sort of bit of information for these irrigators. So a few more details about this field experiment. We randomly assigned well owners into treatment and control groups. So we do that because we think that if an agricultural producer receives some information about one of their wells, that's likely going to influence their pumping behavior for their other wells. And also note that in Kansas, it's not quite the well owner, it's actually the person who filed the most recent water use report. Treated owners receive a mailer comparing their wells' groundwater pumping to that in their comparison prior to the growing season. So we do this in Colorado prior to the 2019 and 2020 growing seasons. And in Kansas, we do this prior to the 2020 growing seasons. And then we estimate the average effect of receiving a mailer on well level annual water use. And we use that using some econometric models with longitudinal data. That's all that is a fancy way of saying is we observe at the well level how much water is used across time. And we can then estimate how receiving a mailer prior to a growing season influences that pumping in that subsequent season. So what we're interested in here is this beta 1, which tells us what's the effect of receiving a mailer on their subsequent water use. And we're controlling for some well level effects. That's what having longitudinal data allows us to do, as well as our experiment blocking variables and growing season weather, because that's generally a really good predictor about how much water people are using. So moving on to our results, these points here are our estimates of the actual effect of receiving a mailer on subsequent water use. So for Kansas, we see here, it's about a 2.8% reduction in water use associated with receiving a social comparison mailer. And these bars around it are 95% confidence intervals, which are also fully below zero. For Colorado, we see a negative point estimate in terms of the influence of the comparison mailer on use, although it's a relatively, we see this confidence interval is actually intercepting zero, so we can't necessarily say that there's been this reduction in groundwater pumping associated with receiving one of these mailers. There's a few hypotheses about why we might not see this effect in Colorado. For one thing, we have a smaller sample size, we have less statistical power to uncover or detect these relatively small effect sizes. Also, we provided information along a different margin in Colorado, total water use rather than water use per acre irrigated. So in conclusion, we find that average treatment effects indicate a small but economically significant reduction in pumping. In Kansas, we see about a 2.8% reduction in groundwater use associated with sending mailers to agricultural producers prior to a growing season.
It looks like we have a majority of people who are already back into the room. So if you want to continue, my apologies. I don't know what happened there.
Yeah, it's like even after a year and a half of Zooming for everything,
it still gets messed up.
It still gets messed up like about a third of the time, I think. It's fine. Okay, I was almost at, I'm sharing my screen again.
Yes, I can see your screen. You're good.
So all I wanted to conclude with is that these results are important because sending these mailers is vastly less expensive than these other policy alternatives like well retirement programs. So conserving 1 acre a foot of water using these mailers cost about 30 cents per acre foot, whereas recent research by some folks at KU found that it cost about $17 to conserve 1 acre foot of water per year. So $17 per year to conserve an acre foot of water using these well retirement programs. The caveat there is that we're not yet sure how repeated treatment affects subsequent water use. So we're not sure if agricultural producers habituate to giving the social comparison information. So that's an avenue for future research. And with that, I'll say thank you, and I guess apologize to everyone for the snafus we had during the presentation. I think I've got time for a few questions.
Yes, you do, and the rooms are going to close again in about 30 seconds. I don't know why. So let's go back to the main room and we can do our questions there for now. How does that sound? Shannon, I've got your thing in the chat, so we'll bring that over to the main room. Sorry, everyone. We did have some comments as a following up on your presentation. Shannon, you can unmute yourself if you want to, but I'll read this aloud too. In many regions, these mailers were probably very beneficial, but in GMD4, they did note that there was some anger about being compared to their neighbors because it was kind of like comparing apples to oranges.
Yeah, I understand that, you know, particularly soil type, right? Like that's something we struggled with when we started this, is what exactly should the comparison group be? So we thought like, okay, should it just be corn growers on sandy soil in your county or in your groundwater management district? Ultimately, what we decided is that we wanted to try to, you know, give maybe the most, you know, for one thing, we didn't want to like get that information wrong. So it's more difficult to say what people are growing, exactly what kind of soil they're on. So that was part of it. We also, you know, we thought that we're going to see a relatively small effect size. And one way to make sure that we still were able to uncover that is to keep our comparison groups relatively large. And part of that just, you know, an outcome of that is that there are some apples to oranges comparisons.
Yeah.
I also saw there was a question in the chat before we got kicked out about.
Yes, from Jeff. Why did the one GMD, why was that one excluded?
And I know Nathan Hendricks is here. Maybe he has a better idea about why we.
Yeah, that was about the time. So that was GMD 5, and in that timing, the Rattlesnake Creek was the Quivira impairment was when we first were doing this was really contentious at that point. And so, you know, there were several things happening, and allocations were about being announced around that time. You know, then they got pulled back, but then sending out the mailer on top of that, there was just a lot of things going on right then. And so we thought that could create some confusion, and so just avoided that area at that particular point in time.
Thanks, Nathan.
Yeah, that's a pretty difficult issue to try and stay away from. Okay, y'all, it's gonna kick us out of breakout rooms again. I don't know what's going on, but our last speaker, from what I can tell, hasn't been able to make it. So I think that's probably the end of this session. So if you want to jump into another breakout room, if they get opened up, I encourage you to do so. And thank you so much to our presenters. I'm so sorry for this kerfuffle today.
This was awesome. Thank